never sent to love you forever. They were sent to delay you. Before your twin flame could enter your life, false lovers were allowed to test your spirit, drain your energy, and distract you from your divine assignment. And the terrifying part, some of them knew exactly how to mimic soul connections. Have you noticed the pattern? The intense attraction, the instant attachment, the promises that collapsed overnight, the people who awakened your deepest wounds instead of your deepest peace. That was not random. Spirit allowed counterfeit connections to appear first because your soul carried a union powerful enough to threaten dark spiritual forces. The closer you moved toward your real twin flame, the more confusion entered your love life. And now, after every betrayal, every abandonment, every painful ending, you're finally beginning to understand why none of them could stay. Because they were never the destination. They were the spiritual training before destiny arrived. Before your twin flame could reach you, something else reached you first. Not by accident, not because you were weak, and not because you kept choosing the wrong people. There is a spiritual truth most people are never told about divine unions. Counterfeit love often appears before destiny. In fact, the closer someone is to meeting their true twin flame, the more intense the false connections become. It is almost as if invisible forces are trying to exhaust the soul before real love can finally arrive. And if you are listening to this right now, there is a reason your heart instantly reacted to those words. Because deep down you already know. You have lived through connections that felt supernatural at first. People entered your life with magnetic energy, almost as if they had known you forever. The chemistry felt impossible to ignore. Conversations flowed too easily. Eye contact felt dangerous. They mirrored your wounds, your dreams, your loneliness. Some of them even said things your soul had secretly been praying to hear. For a moment, you believed you had finally found the one. But then everything changed. Suddenly, the affection became confusion. The warmth became distance. The promises became silence. And the same person who once made you feel chosen became the source of your deepest emotional pain. Why? Why did every connection begin like destiny only to collapse into heartbreak? Why did you keep attracting people who awakened your soul, but could not stay? And why did every ending leave you feeling spiritually exhausted, emotionally shattered, and strangely empty? Because those people were not sent to complete your soul. They were sent to prepare it. There is a hidden spiritual reason false lovers often appear before a twin flame union. And once you understand it, your entire past will begin to make sense. You see, not every intense connection is divine. Some connections are assignments. Some people enter your life carrying karmic energy designed to expose the parts of you that still need healing. They trigger abandonment wounds, insecurity, fear of rejection, unhealthy attachment, and emotional dependency. They force hidden pain to rise to the surface. Not because the universe hates you, but because your soul cannot enter sacred union while carrying unhealed wounds that would eventually destroy it. Most people think love is only about finding the right person. Spirit knows it is also about becoming the right version of yourself before that person arrives. And that process is rarely gentle. Think about your past for a moment. How many times did you ignore red flags because the connection felt spiritually intense? How many times did you confuse emotional chaos with passion? How many times did you stay because you thought suffering was proof of love? Some of you lost years trying to save people who were never assigned to grow with you. Some of you begged for clarity from people who enjoyed your loyalty, but never intended to protect your heart. And some of you are still grieving connections you secretly know were unhealthy because part of you believed they were your final chance at love. But listen carefully. The false lovers were never the reward. They were the lesson before the reward. And this is where things become even more spiritual. Many chosen souls attract counterfeit connections because their energy carries something rare. There is a light within them that naturally draws attention, both positive and negative. People feel your depth before you even speak. They feel your empathy, your sensitivity, your emotional intensity, your spiritual hunger. But wounded people are often attracted to healing energy they are not prepared to honor. So they come close to you. They consume your warmth. They lean on your compassion. They enjoy the safety of your love. But eventually, their unresolved darkness clashes with your soul's purpose. And instead of growing beside you, they begin pulling energy from you. That is why some relationships left you feeling spiritually drained. You were pouring divine energy into people who only came to receive, not reciprocate. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this. Some of those people were never meant to stay long-term, no matter how hard you loved them. Because destiny was still waiting ahead. There is a reason every false connection collapsed when it did. Some ended through betrayal. Some through sudden abandonment. Some through lies, manipulation, cheating, or emotional coldness that appeared without warning. At the time, it felt cruel. You cried. You questioned yourself. You wondered why spirit kept allowing your heart to break. But what if those endings were not punishment? What if they were protection? What if spirit was removing people who could not follow you into your next chapter? Right now, there are people listening to this who still blame themselves for relationships that were spiritually designed to expire. You think you were too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too intense, too loving. But the truth is you were trying to build permanence with temporary people. And temporary people always panic when real depth enters the room. Because depth requires transformation. Depth requires honesty. Depth requires emotional maturity. False lovers want the feeling of love without the responsibility of becoming worthy of it. That is why they run when the connection becomes real. That is why they pull away the moment vulnerability appears. That is why they create confusion instead of clarity. A true twin flame connection may challenge you, but it does not thrive on emotional destruction. Counterfeit love leaves you addicted to uncertainty. Divine love awakens peace beneath the intensity. And this is exactly why your past relationships had to happen first. Without those painful lessons, you would not recognize the difference between obsession and alignment. You would not recognize the difference between attachment and soul resonance. You would not recognize the difference between being desired and being truly seen. The false lovers sharpened your discernment. Every betrayal strengthened your intuition. Every disappointment forced your spirit to evolve. Every ending pushed you closer to the version of yourself capable of sustaining sacred union. That is the part most people never understand. The delay was not empty. The waiting was not meaningless. Spirit was using every painful connection to prepare your heart for something deeper than ordinary. Homancy. Because twin flame unions are not casual relationships. They are spiritual mirrors. They expose everything hidden. They accelerate healing. They awaken dormant parts of the soul. And if you meet that level of connection before emotional preparation happens, the intensity can destroy both people instead of transforming them. So Spirit allowed lessons first. Not to torture you, but to strengthen you. And maybe, just maybe, that is why you suddenly feel different now. Have you noticed it? The old patterns no longer attract you the same way. You're becoming tired of shallow attention. Tired of emotional inconsistency. Tired of people who speak beautifully, but disappear when accountability arrives. Something inside you has changed. You no longer want love that only excites your emotions. You want love that feels spiritually safe. And that shift matters more than you realize. Because many souls encounter their twin flame only after they finally stop chasing counterfeit connections. Only after they release unhealthy attachments. Only after they stop begging temporary people for permanent love. The heartbreak was not the end of your story. It was the separation phase before alignment. And if you are still carrying pain from people who left, hear this clearly. Their inability to love you correctly was never proof that you were unworthy of love. It was proof that they were never assigned to walk beside you forever. Some people enter your life to awaken the wound. Others arrive to help heal it. And your soul is beginning to recognize the difference now. So do not curse every failed relationship from your past. Some of those painful endings saved your destiny. Some of those rejections redirected your entire spiritual path. And some of those false lovers unknowingly pushed you toward the love your soul had been searching. for all along. Because the real connection, it was never lost. It was only delayed until you were ready to recognize it. There was a pattern in your love life that nobody around you seemed to understand. Not your friends. Not your family. Not even the people who claimed they loved you. Because from the outside, it looked like you simply kept choosing the wrong person. People told you to move on, to stop being so emotional, to stop overthinking every connection. Some even blamed you for loving too deeply, as if your ability to feel intensely was the problem. But deep inside, you knew something stranger was happening. The relationships were not random. The timing was not random. Even the pain itself felt strangely repetitive, almost scripted. Different faces, different names, different stories. Yet somehow, the emotional outcome always felt the same. At first, every connection entered your life like a spiritual storm. You met someone unexpectedly. The attraction was immediate. Conversations felt unnatural in the best way possible, as if you had known each other before this lifetime. They understood parts of you that other people ignored. They mirrored your loneliness, your dreams, your emotional depth. Sometimes they even repeated exact phrases you once whispered in private prayers. And because of that, you trusted the connection quickly. Too quickly. Not because you were foolish, but because your soul was searching for familiarity. You were searching for home. That is why the beginning always felt magical. The late-night conversations, the emotional intensity, the feeling that this person is different. The way they looked at you as if they could see through every mask you had ever worn. It felt spiritual. And perhaps that is why the ending hurt so much. Because nobody warns chosen souls that counterfeit connections often imitate destiny before revealing their true purpose. You thought you were finally being seen. But in reality, many of those people were only reflecting your unhealed wounds back to you. That is why the connection felt so consuming. It was not always soul recognition. Sometimes it was wound recognition. And there is a dangerous difference between the two. Wound recognition creates obsession. Soul recognition creates transformation. Wound recognition makes you anxious. Soul recognition brings clarity, even during difficulty. Wound recognition keeps you trapped in emotional cycles. Soul recognition pushes you toward growth. But when you are starving emotionally, it becomes very difficult to tell the difference. Especially if you spent most of your life feeling misunderstood. Especially if you grew up being emotionally neglected, rejected, or unseen. Especially if you became the kind of person who learned to survive by overgiving love in hopes of finally receiving it back. Because people who carry deep emotional wounds often mistake emotional intensity for emotional safety. And that is exactly why the cycle repeated. Some of you met people who love-bombed you in the beginning. They overwhelmed you with attention, constant messages, future promises, words that sounded too perfect to be accidental. They made you feel chosen, special, irreplaceable. And for a brief moment, the emptiness inside you disappeared. But then something shifted. The energy changed without explanation. The same person who once chased you became emotionally distant. Replies became shorter. Affection became inconsistent. You started feeling confused all the time. And suddenly, instead of feeling secure, you found yourself desperately trying to get back the version of them you met in the beginning. But that version was never stable. It was bait. Counterfeit love often begins with emotional intoxication because it relies on attachment, not alignment. Real spiritual connections do not need manipulation to create closeness. They unfold naturally. But false lovers create emotional dependency first, then slowly withdraw it. And the withdrawal is what traps the soul. Because now you are no longer chasing love. You are chasing relief from confusion. That is why some relationships became addictive even when they were hurting you. You kept hoping the person from the beginning would return. You kept replaying memories trying to understand what changed. You blamed yourself. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I ruined everything. But listen carefully. Healthy love does not force you to abandon yourself just to keep someone interested. The reason the pattern felt impossible to escape is because spirit was trying to show you something deeper than romance. Every counterfeit connection exposed a hidden wound inside you. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being not enough, fear that love always disappears. And until those fears surfaced, healing could not begin. That is why some of the most painful relationships entered your life during periods of spiritual awakening. You thought you were being punished. But spiritually, exposure always happens before transformation. The hidden pain had to come into the light. And perhaps the most exhausting part was how isolated you felt during all of it. People around you could not understand why certain connections affected you so deeply. They saw a breakup. You felt a spiritual collapse. They told you to just move on. But your nervous system, your intuition, your emotions, everything felt shaken. Some nights you could not sleep because your mind kept replaying conversations. Some mornings you woke up with anxiety before your feet even touched the floor. Some of you cried in silence because you were embarrassed by how deeply the relationship affected you. Others became emotionally numb because feeling everything became too overwhelming. And through it all, you kept asking the same question. Why does this keep happening to me? Because the lesson was not fully complete yet. There are seasons in life when spirit allows repeated patterns until the soul finally recognizes what it has been tolerating. And many chosen souls tolerate emotional inconsistency for far too long because they mistake suffering for loyalty. You believed staying proved your love. You believed sacrificing yourself proved your devotion. You believed patience would eventually transform the other person. But healing someone is not the same as being destined for them. That realization changes everything. Because some people were never resisting love. They were resisting accountability. They wanted your empathy without changing their behavior. They wanted access to your energy without the responsibility of protecting your heart. And because your soul naturally carries compassion, you kept seeing potential in people who were emotionally unavailable. You kept loving the version of them they could become someday. Meanwhile, Spirit kept trying to show you who they already were. That is why your intuition kept whispering warnings you tried to ignore. You felt the inconsistency early. You sensed the emotional distance. You noticed the mixed signals. But you stayed because the connection felt spiritually important. And that is one of the hardest lessons chosen souls must learn. Not every spiritually intense connection is spiritually healthy. Some connections enter your life specifically to teach discernment, to teach boundaries, to teach self-respect, to teach you that chemistry alone cannot sustain divine union. And now, when you look back honestly, you can finally see the pattern more clearly. Every false lover awakened a different wound. One taught you not to abandon yourself for approval. One taught you to stop confusing attention with commitment. One taught you that being needed is not the same as being valued. One taught you that emotional inconsistency is not passion, it is instability. One taught you that people can deeply desire your energy while still lacking the maturity to love you correctly. None of those lessons felt fair while you were living through them, but your soul was evolving through every heartbreak. Even when you thought you were breaking, something inside you was becoming wiser, stronger, more discerning. And perhaps that is why your standards are changing now. You no longer feel attracted to chaos the same way. The emotional roller coaster no longer excites you like before. You are beginning to crave peace more than intensity, clarity more than fantasy, consistency more than temporary passion. That shift is spiritual maturity. And it happens when the soul becomes exhausted from counterfeit love. Eventually, you stop chasing people who trigger your wounds and start seeking connections that honor your healing. That is the moment your energy changes. And once your energy changes, your destiny begins changing too. Because twin flame unions are not built on emotional games. They are not sustained through manipulation, confusion, or constant fear of abandonment. They require emotional honesty, spiritual growth, mutual awakening, And many souls must first survive counterfeit love before they are emotionally capable of recognizing the real thing. So if your past feels heavy tonight, if your heart still carries grief from people who could not love you properly, do not overlook the deeper truth hidden beneath the pain. Those cycles were not meaningless. Those endings were not random. Every false lover revealed something your soul needed to understand before divine alignment could finally enter your life. And now, you are beginning to see the pattern clearly for the first time. Not as punishment, but as preparation. There is a painful truth about spiritual awakening that most people never talk about. Sometimes your soul must completely lose faith in counterfeit love before it becomes ready for divine love. And that is exactly where many of you are right now. You have reached a point where the old patterns no longer satisfy you, but the new chapter has not fully arrived yet. You feel suspended between worlds. Part of you is healing, but another part still carries grief from everything you survived. Some days you feel strong. Other days you feel emotionally exhausted for no visible reason. You are no longer who you used to be, but you are still becoming who you are meant to become. And that in-between season can feel incredibly lonely. Because while everyone around you continues chasing surface-level relationships, something deeper has awakened inside you. You can no longer pretend emotional inconsistency feels romantic. You can no longer ignore red flags simply because the chemistry is intense. You can no longer force yourself to shrink just to keep someone interested. Your soul has evolved beyond counterfeit love. But evolution is uncomfortable, especially when it requires grieving the version of yourself that once accepted less than you deserved. You see, many chosen souls were conditioned from an early age to believe love must be earned through suffering. Maybe you grew up in an environment where emotional needs were ignored. Maybe affection was inconsistent. Maybe you were only praised when you sacrificed yourself for others. Maybe you became the strong one, the understanding one, the person who carried everyone else's emotions while secretly drowning in your own. And because of that conditioning, your nervous system learned something dangerous. It learned to associate emotional struggle with emotional connection. That is why peaceful love once felt unfamiliar to you. Chaos felt exciting. Uncertainty felt meaningful. You mistook emotional highs and lows for passion because your soul had never fully experienced stable love before. And counterfeit lovers unconsciously sensed that wound. They recognized your empathy, your patience, your willingness to keep forgiving, your tendency to see potential in broken people. So they entered your life carrying lessons disguised as romance. Some of them reflected your abandonment wounds. Others reflected your fear of rejection. Others exposed your habit of overgiving to people who only gave the bare minimum in return. Each connection was spiritually designed to reveal where your self-worth was still fragile. Not to humiliate you, but to awaken you. Because a twin flame union cannot survive if one soul is constantly abandoning themselves to keep the connection alive. Read that again carefully. Divine love is not built upon self-destruction. It is built upon alignment. And alignment requires truth. That is why Spirit allowed certain people to disappoint you repeatedly. Not because you were cursed. Not because love was being withheld from you. But because every painful experience was exposing unconscious patterns you were still carrying into relationships. Patterns like over-explaining your worth, begging for consistency, feeling responsible for fixing emotionally unavailable people, ignoring intuition because loneliness felt heavier than red flags, accepting confusion because you feared being alone, and perhaps the deepest wound of all, believing that if you loved hard enough, someone would eventually choose you completely. But real love does not require convincing. Real love does not require emotional survival tactics. Real love does not leave you constantly questioning where you stand. The reason your soul had to break first is because your old understanding of love could not follow you into your next spiritual chapter. You had to unlearn survival love. You had to unlearn attachment disguised as devotion. You had to unlearn the belief that suffering is proof of emotional depth. And those lessons often arrive through heartbreak, because heartbreak forces truth into the open. When someone betrays you, abandons you, or suddenly changes after making promises, the illusion collapses. The fantasy dies, and underneath the fantasy, your soul finally confronts the deeper question. Why was I willing to settle for crumbs while calling it love? That question changes people. It changes the way you see yourself. It changes the way you approach relationships. And eventually, it changes the energy you attract. Many of you listening to this are no longer emotionally available for the relationships you once begged to keep. That is growth, not bitterness. Growth. You are beginning to recognize the difference between being wanted temporarily and being valued intentionally. And the more your discernment grows, the more isolated you may temporarily feel. Because awakening often creates distance between you and environments that once felt familiar. Suddenly, shallow conversations drain you. Forced connections exhaust you. People who only call when they need emotional support begin to feel heavy. Even certain friendships start fading because your energy no longer resonates with the same dynamics. This is not punishment. This is spiritual separation before alignment. Spirit is removing emotional noise so you can finally hear your own intuition clearly. And intuition becomes extremely important before a twin flame union enters your life. Because twin flame energy is not based on fantasy. It is based on recognition. Not recognition of perfection. Recognition of truth. A true twin flame connection forces both souls to confront themselves honestly. That is why these unions are often delayed until emotional maturity begins developing. Imagine meeting your divine counterpart while still addicted to toxic cycles. Imagine entering sacred union while still seeking validation from emotionally unavailable people. Imagine encountering your twin flame while still believing love must be chased, earned, or begged for. The connection would collapse under the weight of unhealed wounds. So spirit delays what the ego wants quickly in order to protect what the soul needs permanently. That is why some of your prayers seemed unanswered. That is why certain doors closed unexpectedly. That is why some relationships ended right when you thought they were becoming serious. And yes, at the time, it felt devastating. Some of you cried until your chest physically hurt. Some of you lost sleep replaying every memory. Some of you questioned your value because someone else failed to recognize it. But now, from a higher perspective, you are beginning to understand something important. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to accompany you into your destiny. Some people are only meant to introduce the lesson. And once the lesson is learned, their role ends. The pain came from trying to hold on to people whose spiritual assignment in your life was already complete. That is why certain connections became harder the longer they continued. Your soul was evolving beyond them. You were trying to force permanence onto relationships spirit had already marked as temporary. And perhaps your spirit sensed this before your mind could accept it. Have you noticed how exhausted you became near the end of certain relationships? How your body felt heavy? How anxiety increased? How your intuition kept whispering that something was wrong even when you tried to stay hopeful? Your soul was reacting to misalignment. Because spiritually aligned love does not require constant self-betrayal. And this realization marks the beginning of true healing. Healing begins the moment you stop romanticizing emotional suffering. Healing begins the moment you stop chasing people who only appreciate your value after losing access to you. Healing begins the moment you realize your sensitivity was never weakness, it was discernment waiting to awaken. For years, some of you called yourself too emotional because emotionally unavailable people made you feel difficult to love. But emotionally mature love does not punish vulnerability. It protects it. And that changes everything. Because now your standards are shifting at a soul level. You no longer crave intensity without stability. You no longer want temporary attention disguised as connection. You no longer feel impressed by words unsupported by action. Your soul is becoming selective, intentional, spiritually aware. And although this stage can feel lonely, it is actually sacred preparation. You are being emotionally rewired for the kind of connection your old self could not sustain. That is why your spirit now rejects what it once chased. Because you are approaching alignment. The counterfeit relationships had to break your illusions first. They had to expose your wounds. They had to teach you discernment. They had to separate you from unhealthy attachments. Not because spirit wanted you to suffer forever, but because your soul was being prepared for a love that would require authenticity instead of survival. And maybe for the first time in your life, you are finally beginning to understand this. The breaking was never the end. The breaking was the awakening before destiny. What if the people who hurt you the most were never sent to destroy you? What if they were sent to reveal you to yourself? That question changes everything. Because most people spend years looking at heartbreak from the wrong perspective. They focus only on what they lost. The relationship, the future they imagined, the version of the person they hoped would eventually change. But spiritually awakened souls eventually discover something deeper. Every betrayal carried a message. Every disappointment exposed an illusion. And every painful ending forced the soul closer to truth. At first, that truth feels unbearable. Because when someone betrays you, your mind immediately searches for reasons. You replay conversations. You analyze memories. You wonder which moment everything changed. Part of you becomes obsessed with understanding why someone who once claimed to love you could suddenly become cold, distant, dishonest, or emotionally unavailable. And perhaps the most painful part is this. Many of the people who hurt you once made you feel safe. That is why betrayal cuts so deeply. Not because strangers disappointed you, but because you trusted them with vulnerable parts of yourself. You trusted them with your hope, your softness, your future, your emotional truth. And when they mishandled it, something inside you shattered. Some of you were betrayed through lies, others through cheating, others through emotional abandonment that happened slowly over time. Some of you watched someone lose interest right after you finally opened your heart completely. And because the pain was so intense, you began questioning your own worth. What is wrong with me? Why do people always leave? Why am I never enough for the people I love? But listen carefully. The betrayal was never proof that you lacked value. The betrayal revealed the emotional limitations of the other person. People can only love as deeply as they have healed themselves. And wounded people often destroy what they are not emotionally prepared to sustain. That is why some people enter your life loving your light, but eventually resent the transformation your light requires from them. Because real love demands growth. Real intimacy demands honesty. And many emotionally immature people crave connection, while simultaneously fearing the vulnerability it requires. So instead of evolving, they retreat. They avoid. They sabotage. They run. And chosen souls often internalize that behavior as personal rejection. But spiritually, rejection and redirection are sometimes the same thing. You see, many false lovers entered your life carrying unhealed wounds of their own. Some feared abandonment. Some feared commitment. Some depended on validation from multiple people because they lacked inner stability. Some enjoyed receiving love more than giving it. And because your soul naturally radiated compassion, you became a mirror they could not avoid. Your presence exposed things inside them they had spent years suppressing. Their insecurity, their emotional immaturity, their fear of genuine intimacy, their unresolved trauma. That is why certain people pulled away the moment the connection became emotionally real. Not because the connection lacked depth, but because the depth terrified them. A spiritually aligned connection forces hidden wounds to surface. And not everyone is willing to confront themselves honestly. That is why some relationships collapse right when they appear most promising. The soul begins demanding authenticity, and false foundations cannot survive authenticity for long. Have you noticed that pattern? Some people love the fantasy version of connection. The excitement, the attention, the emotional intoxication. But once accountability, consistency, and emotional responsibility entered the relationship, everything changed. Suddenly they became confused, distant, uncertain, not because love disappeared overnight, but because the relationship stopped feeding the ego and started challenging the soul. And counterfeit love rarely survives soul-level truth. This is why your betrayals carried spiritual purpose. Not because pain itself is holy, but because pain exposes what comfort often hides. Think about who you became after heartbreak. More discerning, more self-aware, more intuitive. You began noticing energy instead of just words. You stopped trusting chemistry alone. You learned how to recognize emotional inconsistency faster. And slowly, your soul began separating fantasy from alignment. That transformation mattered, because before certain betrayals, many of you were still willing to abandon yourselves to keep someone else. You tolerated mixed signals. You accepted bare minimum effort. You over-explained your needs to emotionally unavailable people hoping they would finally understand. You ignored intuition because loneliness felt scarier than settling. But betrayal changes people, especially spiritual betrayal. It forces the soul to confront uncomfortable truths about what it has been tolerating. And while that process feels devastating, it is often the beginning of awakening. Many chosen souls experience their deepest spiritual growth immediately after emotional collapse. Not during comfort, not during stability, but during seasons where everything they depended on suddenly disappears. Because when illusions fall apart, truth finally has room to enter. And perhaps this explains why some of you changed so dramatically after your last heartbreak. You became quieter, more selective, more protective of your energy. Not because your heart became cold, but because your spirit became wiser. You finally realized that not everyone deserves unlimited access to your softness. That realization is sacred, because empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And many chosen souls were never taught healthy boundaries growing up. They were taught to overgive, overforgive, oversacrifice, to keep loving no matter how poorly they were treated. But spirit cannot lead you into divine union while you are still normalizing emotional neglect. So betrayal became the interruption, the wake-up call, the mirror. Some of you begged spirit to save relationships that later revealed themselves to be spiritually draining. And now, looking back, you realize something shocking. If certain people had stayed, they would have delayed your healing even longer. That is why some endings happened suddenly. That is why communication disappeared without explanation. That is why doors closed even when your heart desperately wanted them to remain open. At the time, it felt cruel. Now you are beginning to understand it may have been protection. Because spirit sees beyond your temporary emotions. Spirit sees the long-term destiny attached to your soul. And sometimes people must be removed before they completely disconnect you from yourself. There are relationships that slowly convince people to betray their own intuition, to silence their own needs, to shrink their personality, to accept emotional confusion as normal, to chase validation instead of peace. And spirit will eventually disrupt any connection that requires you to abandon your authentic self in order to maintain it. That disruption often arrives through betrayal. Painful, unexpected, but spiritually necessary. And perhaps the hardest part of this journey is grieving not only the person but the future you imagined with them. Some of you were not mourning reality. You were mourning potential. The imagined version of the relationship. The promises. The hope that things would finally become stable someday. But your soul cannot build destiny on someday. Your soul requires truth now. And truth is one of the clearest signs of divine alignment. A real twin flame connection may challenge you deeply, but it does not thrive on deception. It does not require endless confusion to sustain itself. It does not survive through emotional starvation. Divine union awakens healing, not constant emotional chaos. That is why your past betrayals mattered so much spiritually. They taught your soul what divine love is not. And sometimes the clearest path toward truth begins by repeatedly experiencing what lacks truth entirely. Every false lover refined your discernment. Every disappointment sharpened your intuition. Every painful ending strengthened your connection to yourself. You may not have realized it then, but each betrayal was separating you from old versions of love that could never carry you into your next chapter. And now, you are finally beginning to recognize the difference between people who are emotionally attracted to you and people who are spiritually aligned with you. One drains your soul. The other nourishes it. One creates confusion. The other creates clarity. One keeps you trapped in anxiety. The other helps you feel emotionally safe enough to grow. That difference changes everything. Because once your soul experiences awakening, you can no longer romanticize emotional suffering the same way. You begin craving honesty more than intensity, consistency more than fantasy, peace more than temporary validation. And that shift signals something powerful. Your spirit is no longer preparing for counterfeit love. It is preparing for alignment. So if betrayal changed you, if heartbreak forced you into isolation, if disappointment shattered illusions you once desperately wanted to believe, do not assume your story is ruined. Some souls must lose false love before they are spiritually capable of recognizing real love. And perhaps every painful ending was not evidence that destiny abandoned you, but evidence that destiny refused to let you settle for less than what your soul was truly meant to receive. If your twin flame connection was truly destined, then why did it take so long? Why did spirit allow years of confusion, heartbreak, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion before alignment finally began? Why did you have to watch other people fall in love while your own journey felt blocked, delayed, or painfully incomplete? Those questions have haunted many chosen souls. Because when you carry deep love inside your spirit, waiting can feel unbearable, especially when your heart has already survived so much disappointment. There were moments when you wondered if real love simply was not meant for you. Moments when you questioned whether the universe forgot about you entirely. But what if the delay was never rejection? What if the delay was protection? You see, most people think divine timing is punishment because they only see the waiting period from a human perspective. They focus on loneliness, unanswered prayers, missed opportunities, closed doors. But Spirit sees timing differently. Spirit is not only concerned with what you desire. Spirit is concerned with what your soul is truly prepared to sustain. And twin flame unions are not ordinary relationships. They are spiritually catalytic connections that accelerate awakening, healing, transformation, and emotional truth. When two souls carrying mirror energy finally encounter each other, hidden wounds rise rapidly to the surface. That is why these unions can feel overwhelming. A twin flame does not simply enter your life to make you feel loved. They enter your life to awaken your authentic self. And awakening is not comfortable. In fact, many people would run from the intensity of a true twin flame connection if they encountered it too early. That is why delays happen. Not to deny the union, but to prevent destruction before emotional readiness develops. Think about who you were several years ago. Would your younger self have recognized healthy love? Or would you have sabotaged it out of fear, insecurity, or attachment to unhealthy patterns? Be honest with yourself. Many of you once confused emotional chaos with passion. You chased unavailable people because inconsistency felt familiar. You tolerated mixed signals because you feared abandonment more than misalignment. You overgave in relationships, hoping love would eventually become stable if you proved your worth long enough. And if a true twin flame had entered your life during that stage, the connection may have collapsed under the weight of unhealed wounds. Because sacred unions expose everything. They expose fear, ego, jealousy, control, emotional avoidance, attachment wounds, self-worth issues. Nothing remains hidden for long inside these connections. That is why Spirit often prepares both souls separately before allowing alignment to unfold fully. And sometimes that preparation takes years. Years of lessons. Years of endings. Years of painful realizations. Years of isolation. Not because spirit enjoys watching you suffer, but because transformation requires time. A seed cannot become a tree overnight, and souls cannot sustain divine union while emotionally operating from survival mode. Many chosen souls were surviving emotionally for most of their lives. Surviving rejection, surviving neglect, surviving inconsistent love, surviving environments where they constantly felt misunderstood. Some of you became hyper-independent because trusting others felt dangerous. Others became overly attached because abandonment wounds ran so deep. Some learned to suppress emotions entirely. Others gave too much emotionally because they feared being forgotten. These patterns do not disappear simply because love arrives. They must first be healed consciously. And that healing process is exactly why spirit delayed certain connections. You thought your life was falling apart. Spirit knew your identity was being rebuilt. You thought you were being abandoned. Spirit knew you were being redirected. You thought love kept leaving because you were unworthy. Spirit knew temporary people could not accompany you into your next chapter. That perspective changes everything. Because now you can finally understand why certain relationships failed no matter how hard you tried to save them. Some relationships ended because they were misaligned from the beginning. Others ended because your soul outgrew them spiritually. And some ended because spirit refused to allow counterfeit love to permanently occupy the space meant for divine alignment. That is why sudden endings often happen right before major spiritual shifts. The soul must become emotionally available for the next chapter. And emotional availability requires release. Release of old attachments. Release of unhealthy coping mechanisms. Release of the belief that love must be earned through suffering. For many of you, the delay became a season of purification. Painful but necessary. Spirit was teaching you how to stop abandoning yourself. How to stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. How to stop ignoring your intuition. How to stop confusing temporary intensity with lasting alignment. Because twin flame unions require emotional truth. Not performance. Not fantasy. Truth. And truth demands healing. This is also why many people encounter long periods of isolation before meeting or reuniting with their twin flame. Isolation is not always punishment. Sometimes isolation is spiritual detoxification. Spirit removes distractions so the soul can finally hear itself clearly. Without constant emotional noise. Without toxic attachments. Without external validation controlling your decisions. And yes, those seasons can feel deeply lonely. Some nights you questioned whether anyone would ever truly understand you. Some mornings you woke up emotionally exhausted even when nothing bad had happened. You felt disconnected from old environments. Disconnected from people you once related to. Even disconnected from versions of yourself that used to feel familiar. That is because awakening changes your energetic frequency. What once attracted you no longer resonates the same way. The conversations feel shallow. The emotional games feel exhausting. The temporary attention feels empty. Your soul begins craving something deeper. Something real. Something spiritually safe. And that shift is one of the clearest signs that preparation is occurring. Because before divine union arrives, your spirit often loses appetite for counterfeit connection entirely. You stop wanting love that requires self-betrayal. You stop chasing people who create confusion. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. And eventually, you begin valuing peace more than emotional stimulation. That emotional maturity matters. Because many people say they want sacred love while still emotionally addicted to toxic patterns. Spirit cannot align you with divine partnership while you are still choosing people who repeatedly disconnect you from yourself. So the delay continues until the lesson becomes embodied. Not intellectually understood. Embodied. There is a difference. You can know your worth mentally while still tolerating mistreatment emotionally. You can understand boundaries theoretically while still abandoning them out of loneliness. You can desire healthy love while unconsciously choosing familiar pain. That is why healing takes time. And spirit works through repetition until the soul truly transforms. Some of you had to experience multiple counterfeit relationships before finally recognizing the pattern. Not because you were foolish, but because the wound was deep. The soul learns through experience. And eventually, after enough heartbreak, something shifts internally. You stop asking, "How do I make this person stay?" And you begin asking, "Why am I chasing people who cannot meet me emotionally?" That question marks the beginning of awakening. Because now the focus returns to you. Your healing, your standards, your discernment, your relationship with yourself. And strangely enough, that is often when alignment begins approaching. Not when you are desperately searching for love, but when your soul finally becomes unwilling to betray itself for love. That energetic shift is powerful. Because twin flame energy responds to authenticity. Not desperation. Not emotional dependency. Authenticity. That is why some of you suddenly feel different lately. More protective of your peace. More intuitive. Less interested in proving your worth. More willing to walk away from emotionally draining situations. That is not emotional coldness. That is spiritual evolution. And perhaps the greatest truth about divine timing is this. Spirit was never trying to delay your happiness. Spirit was preparing you to sustain it. Because if sacred love enters your life before emotional maturity develops, fear will sabotage what destiny intended to heal. So the waiting period became preparation. The heartbreak became refinement. The loneliness became awakening. The endings became redirection. And every painful lesson carried you one step closer to alignment, even when you could not see it. Even when you cried through it. Even when you thought nothing meaningful was happening at all. Your soul was changing. Quietly. Deeply. Permanently. And now, because of everything you survived, you are becoming capable of recognizing the difference between a connection that only consumes your emotions and a connection that truly nourishes your spirit. That discernment is sacred. Because the soul that once begged for inconsistent love is no longer the soul standing here today. You have evolved. You have awakened. And maybe that is why Spirit waited. Not to deny your destiny, but to ensure that when divine love finally arrives, you will no longer confuse it with counterfeit love again. At some point during your healing journey, something unexpected began happening. You stopped looking at love the same way. The people who once would have consumed your attention no longer impressed you. The emotional games that once kept you awake at night suddenly felt exhausting instead of exciting. The inconsistency that once triggered obsession now triggered clarity. And without fully realizing it, your soul began preparing to recognize something different. Because after enough counterfeit love, spiritually awakened souls start noticing the difference between connections that drain energy and connections that restore it. That difference matters more than most people understand, especially when it comes to a true twin flame connection. You see, many people imagine twin flames as relationships built only on passion, obsession, or supernatural intensity. And yes, the energy can feel incredibly powerful. The recognition can feel immediate. The emotional mirror can feel overwhelming. But one of the clearest signs of a true twin flame connection is not chaos. It is recognition beneath the intensity. A strange sense of familiarity that feels older than logic. It feels as though your soul remembers something your mind cannot explain. That is why many people describe their twin flame encounter in almost identical ways. I felt like I already knew them. It felt like coming home. I could not explain the connection logically. It scared me because it felt too real. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Unlike counterfeit connections, which often begin with emotional intoxication and confusion, twin flame energy awakens awareness. Not addiction. Awareness. A counterfeit lover usually keeps your nervous system trapped in anxiety. You overanalyze messages. You fear abandonment constantly. You feel emotionally unstable because the connection depends on inconsistency to survive. But when true soul recognition begins happening, something deeper emerges beneath the intensity. clarity, even during separation, even during challenges, even during uncertainty. Your soul recognizes the difference between emotional manipulation and spiritual alignment. And many of you are beginning to understand that now because your past relationships taught you exactly what divine connection is not. False lovers consumed your energy. A twin flame activates your evolution. False lovers forced you to chase validation. A twin flame forces you to confront yourself honestly. False lovers made you abandon your intuition. A twin flame strengthens it. That is why these connections often feel spiritually uncomfortable at first. Because real alignment does not simply flatter the ego. It exposes the soul. And exposure can feel terrifying when someone truly sees you. Not the mask. Not the performance. Not the version of yourself designed to survive rejection. The real you. Your wounds. Your fears. Your emotional patterns. Your hidden longing for unconditional connection. A true twin flame mirrors all of it back to you. That is why many spiritually awakened people initially run from these connections or experience intense fear once the bond deepens. Not because the connection lacks truth, but because the truth feels impossible to hide from. And this is exactly why counterfeit connections often appear first. They prepare your discernment. Without those painful lessons, you might mistake obsession for destiny forever. You might continue chasing emotionally unavailable people because intensity feels familiar. You might continue ignoring your intuition because chemistry blinds you. But after enough heartbreak, your spirit changes. You begin noticing subtle things. How your body reacts around certain people. How your nervous system feels after conversations. How some connections leave you emotionally depleted while others strangely calm your spirit. This awareness is spiritual maturity. And it becomes extremely important before a twin flame union fully unfolds. Because contrary to popular belief, divine connections are not sustained by fantasy alone. They require emotional readiness, self-awareness, honesty, spiritual growth. Without those things, even sacred connections can collapse into chaos. That is why many twin flame journeys include periods of separation. Not because the bond is fake, but because the healing is incomplete. Sometimes one soul awakens before the other. Sometimes fear interrupts alignment. Sometimes old wounds create resistance. And sometimes spirit separates both people temporarily, so deeper transformation can occur. Individually first. This is one of the hardest parts of the journey to understand, because separation often feels like abandonment at first. Especially after surviving so many counterfeit relationships already. The mind immediately fears. Here we go again. Another person leaving. Another painful ending. But spiritually, twin flame separation feels different from counterfeit abandonment. Counterfeit love leaves emptiness. Twin flame separation often leaves awakening. Even through pain, your soul begins transforming. You become more introspective, more spiritually aware, more conscious of your emotional patterns. The connection forces growth whether you resist it or not. And that is one of the clearest distinctions. False lovers distract you from yourself. Twin flame energy returns you to yourself. Read that again carefully. Counterfeit relationships often pull your attention outward endlessly. You become consumed with earning love, fixing problems, seeking reassurance, chasing clarity, trying to feel chosen. But authentic soul alignment redirects your focus inward. Toward healing. Toward truth. Toward emotional responsibility. Toward spiritual evolution. And although the process can feel intense, it ultimately leads you closer to peace, not farther away from it. That is why many spiritually awakened people eventually realize something shocking. The deepest part of the twin flame journey is not actually about romance. It is about awakening. Romance is only the doorway. The real transformation happens within the soul. The connection forces both people to confront unresolved wounds, illusions, fears, ego attachments, and emotional patterns that have remained hidden for years. And that transformation changes everything. It changes how you love, how you communicate, how you see yourself, how you choose relationships, how you protect your energy, how you define intimacy. This is why spiritually aligned love feels completely different after awakening. Before healing, many of you were attracted to emotional intensity because your nervous system associated unpredictability with passion. After healing, peace begins feeling attractive instead. Not boring. Safe. There is a difference. Counterfeit love creates emotional addiction. Divine alignment creates emotional safety. Counterfeit love keeps you performing for affection. Divine alignment allows authenticity. Counterfeit love leaves you questioning your worth. Divine alignment reminds you of it. And once your soul experiences that energetic difference, you can no longer settle for confusion disguised as connection. That is why some of you have recently become more detached from old relationship patterns. You no longer crave constant validation. You no longer romanticize unavailable people. You no longer feel impressed by words unsupported by consistent action. Your spirit has evolved beyond emotional survival mode. And because of that, your discernment is becoming stronger. You are beginning to recognize energetic truth faster than before. You can sense manipulation more clearly. You notice emotional inconsistency immediately. You feel when someone is connected to your energy authentically versus when they are simply attracted to your light temporarily. This awareness protects your destiny. Because spiritually awakened souls must learn the difference between being spiritually activated and being spiritually aligned. Not every intense connection is your twin flame. Some people activate wounds. Some activate healing. And discernment is what separates the two. This is also why your intuition may feel louder lately. Have you noticed it? The inner knowing. The unexplainable feelings. The dreams. The repeated synchronicities. The strange sense that your life is shifting emotionally even before visible evidence appears. Many twin flame journeys begin internally before physical alignment fully unfolds. Your soul senses change before your eyes can see it. And although the waiting period can feel frustrating, Spirit often uses this time to strengthen emotional stability within both souls. Because sacred connections cannot survive where ego dominates completely. They require surrender, humility, growth, emotional accountability. And perhaps this explains why your standards are changing now. You're no longer asking, "Who wants me?" You're beginning to ask, "Who aligns with my spirit?" That question changes your entire reality. Because spiritually aligned love is not built upon emotional performance. It is built upon resonance, truth, mutual evolution, an inner peace strong enough to survive vulnerability. That is why your twin flame was never meant to feel exactly like the others. The counterfeit connections taught anxiety. The real connection teaches awakening. The counterfeit connections taught attachment. The real connection teaches transformation. The counterfeit connections pulled you away from yourself. The real connection slowly guides you back home to your soul. And maybe that is why your spirit survived every false lover before this moment. Not because your story was cursed. Not because destiny forgot you. But because your soul needed enough wisdom to finally recognize the difference between temporary emotional intensity and authentic divine alignment when it finally arrives. There is a stage in the twin flame journey that almost nobody is prepared for. A stage so emotionally intense that many people mistake it for the end of their story when in reality, it is the final transformation before alignment begins. Spiritual teachers call it the dark night of the soul. But for many chosen souls, it does not feel spiritual at all while it is happening. It feels like loss, confusion, isolation, emotional exhaustion. It feels like watching old versions of yourself collapse while having no idea who you are becoming next. And perhaps the hardest part is this. During the dark night of the soul, almost everything that once gave you emotional certainty begins falling apart at the same time. Relationships change. Friendships fade. Old goals stop fulfilling you. You lose interest in environments that once felt familiar. Even your identity begins shifting in ways you cannot fully explain. You start feeling disconnected from the person you used to be. And that experience can feel terrifying, because human beings naturally crave stability. We want clarity, direction, control. But spiritual transformation rarely unfolds in comfortable ways, especially before a sacred union enters your life. You see, many people imagine twin flame alignment as a reward that suddenly appears one day and magically heals loneliness forever. But spiritually, these unions often arrive only after the soul has been stripped of false identities, unhealthy attachments, and emotional illusions. Why? Because divine love cannot fully enter a life still dominated by emotional survival patterns. And the dark night of the soul exists to expose those patterns completely. That is why this stage feels so heavy emotionally. Everything hidden rises to the surface. Old grief, abandonment wounds, fear of rejection, fear of being unloved, fear of being alone forever. Suddenly emotions you thought you buried years ago begin resurfacing again. Memories replay in your mind. Past heartbreaks return emotionally. You begin questioning your worth, your purpose, your direction, even your faith. Some days you feel emotionally numb. Other days you cry without fully understanding why. And because this transformation happens internally first, many people around you cannot understand what you are experiencing. They see you becoming quieter, more withdrawn, more introspective, but they cannot see the spiritual reconstruction happening beneath the surface. Because that is exactly what the dark night of the soul is. A reconstruction. The old version of you is dying emotionally, so a more authentic version can emerge spiritually. And know that process is not easy, especially for chosen souls who spent most of their lives defining themselves through relationships, validation, or emotional attachment. When those attachments begin collapsing, the ego panics. The ego immediately interprets loss as failure. But spiritually, collapse is often preparation. Some of the relationships that ended during this season were never meant to continue into your next chapter. Some people were connected to older versions of you that your soul was already outgrowing. Some environments were keeping you emotionally asleep. Some attachments were preventing deeper healing. And spirit knew that as painful as separation felt, remaining spiritually stagnant would hurt even more long-term. That is why certain endings felt so sudden. One moment you were trying desperately to hold everything together. The next moment, your entire emotional reality shifted. At first, you resisted it. Most people do. You tried to hold on to old connections, old identities, old emotional patterns. But eventually, exhaustion forced surrender. And surrender is where the real transformation begins. Because surrender does not mean giving up on love. It means releasing the illusion that love must come through control, chasing fear, or emotional self-sacrifice. That realization changes the soul deeply, especially after years of counterfeit relationships. Many of you spent years trying to earn love by overgiving emotionally. You became hyper-attentive to other people's needs while neglecting your own. You believed patience, loyalty, and self-sacrifice would eventually convince someone to love you consistently. But the dark night strips away those illusions. It forces you to confront painful truths. You cannot heal people who refuse accountability. You cannot force emotional maturity. You cannot build divine connection through self-abandonment. And most importantly, you cannot meet your twin flame fully while disconnected from yourself. That is why isolation becomes such a major part of spiritual awakening. Not because spirit wants you lonely, but because solitude reveals who you are without emotional distraction, without validation, without performance, without constantly adapting yourself to maintain connection with others. For the first time, you begin hearing your own soul clearly. And sometimes what you hear initially is painful. You realize how much emotional energy you wasted chasing unavailable people. You realize how many red flags you ignored because you feared abandonment. You realize how often you settled for temporary attention because part of you secretly believed deep, lasting love was impossible. Those realizations hurt, but they also awaken you, because awareness is the beginning of freedom. And the dark night of the soul is ultimately about freedom. Freedom from unhealthy attachment. Freedom from emotional dependency. Freedom from old wounds controlling your decisions. Freedom from confusing suffering with love. This is why many chosen souls emerge from this season completely transformed. Not perfect, but awakened. They stop begging for clarity from people committed to confusion. They stop shrinking themselves to avoid rejection. They stop romanticizing inconsistency. They stop chasing emotionally unavailable people hoping the ending will somehow change. Instead, something inside them becomes calmer, stronger, more discerning. And perhaps the most important transformation of all is this. They begin choosing themselves. Not selfishly, spiritually. Because self-abandonment can never lead to sacred union. And many twin flame journeys require both souls to learn this lesson separately before true alignment becomes possible. This is also why some people feel their twin flame most intensely during periods of separation or solitude. When external distractions disappear, spiritual awareness increases. You begin sensing energy differently. Dreams become vivid. Synchronicities increase. Your intuition sharpens. You feel emotionally connected to something larger than logic can explain. And although this stage can feel overwhelming, it is often evidence that deep inner transformation is occurring. The soul is awakening beyond surface-level reality. You begin understanding love differently. Not as possession, not as obsession, but as resonance, truth, alignment, mutual evolution. That perspective changes how you approach relationships forever. Before awakening, many of you feared being alone. After awakening, you begin fearing losing yourself more than loneliness. That shift is powerful, because once your soul reaches that level of awareness, counterfeit love can no longer satisfy you the same way. You start craving emotional safety instead of emotional chaos. You start valuing honesty more than temporary chemistry. You start recognizing peace as a sign of alignment rather than boredom. And ironically, this is often the exact moment divine connection begins drawing closer. Not when you are desperately searching for someone to complete you, but when your soul finally stops abandoning itself to avoid solitude. Because twin flame unions are not meant to complete broken people. They are meant to unite awakened souls. And awakening often requires the complete collapse of false identity first. That is why your dark night felt so painful. You were not only grieving people. You were grieving old versions of yourself. The version that accepted breadcrumbs. The version that tolerated confusion. The version that believed suffering was necessary to keep love. The version that kept chasing emotionally unavailable people, hoping to finally feel chosen. That version of you had to dissolve. Not because it was weak, but because your soul was evolving beyond survival. And although the process felt lonely, Spirit never abandoned you during it. Even in your lowest moments, transformation was unfolding invisibly. Every painful realization strengthened discernment. Every ending redirected your path. Every season of isolation deepened your connection to yourself. You may not have recognized it at the time, but the dark night of the soul was preparing you for a different kind of love entirely. A love built on truth instead of illusion. A love built on alignment instead of attachment. A love that would not require you to betray your spirit in order to maintain it. And maybe that is why everything had to fall apart first. Because the old version of you could never enter divine union safely. Only the awakened version could. So if your soul has felt tired lately, if you have felt emotionally detached from old patterns, if isolation has forced you into deep self-reflection, do not assume your life is falling apart permanently. Some souls must walk through darkness before they can recognize sacred light when it finally appears. And perhaps your dark night was never punishment at all. Perhaps it was the final purification before destiny. There comes a moment in every spiritual awakening where the soul becomes too tired to continue, repeating old patterns. Not because the heart stops wanting love, but because the spirit can no longer survive counterfeit love without collapsing emotionally. And for many chosen souls, this moment changes everything. It does not happen loudly. There is no dramatic announcement from the universe. No visible sign appears overnight. Instead, the transformation begins quietly. One day, you simply realize you are exhausted. Exhausted from overthinking mixed signals. Exhausted from trying to decode inconsistent behavior. Exhausted from carrying relationships emotionally while the other person contributes confusion. Exhausted from begging silently for the bare minimum while pretending you are understanding. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is this. You begin recognizing how often you abandoned yourself just to avoid being abandoned by someone else. That realization cuts deeply, because many spiritually sensitive people spent years believing love meant endurance. They believed staying through mistreatment proved loyalty. They believed patience would eventually transform emotionally unavailable people into emotionally safe partners. But eventually, the soul reaches a breaking point. A sacred breaking point. The moment where survival patterns stop feeling sustainable. And this moment often arrives after one final disappointment that changes your perspective forever. For some people, it is betrayal. For others, ghosting. For others, emotional neglect that slowly drains hope over time. But whatever form it takes, the emotional impact feels different from previous heartbreaks. Because this time, something inside you finally awakens completely. You stop asking, how do I make them love me correctly? And you begin asking, why have I been fighting so hard for people who continuously disconnect me from myself? That question marks the beginning of spiritual liberation. Because now your attention shifts inward instead of outward. You begin observing your own patterns honestly. The attachment, the fear, the overgiving, the emotional self-sacrifice, the tendency to romanticize potential instead of accepting reality. And although those realizations hurt initially, they also become the doorway toward healing. Because healing begins the moment truth becomes impossible to ignore. For years, many chosen souls confused emotional intensity with soul connection. They believed obsessive thinking meant destiny. They believed anxiety meant passion. They believed emotional suffering meant the relationship was spiritually important. But eventually, the nervous system becomes exhausted from living in constant emotional instability. And that exhaustion becomes spiritual wisdom. You start realizing something profound. Real love should not require you to betray your peace repeatedly. Read that slowly. Because many of you normalized emotional chaos for so long that peace initially felt unfamiliar. You associated calmness with boredom because your nervous system had become conditioned to emotional unpredictability. That conditioning often begins long before romantic relationships. Some of you grew up in emotionally unstable environments where love felt inconsistent from childhood. Affection appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Validation was conditional. Emotional safety was uncertain. And because those experiences shaped your nervous system early, chaos began feeling emotionally familiar later in life. That is why counterfeit lovers felt magnetic. Not because they were destined for you, but because they activated old emotional wounds you had not healed yet. They triggered the part of you still searching for validation, still trying to earn consistency, still hoping love would finally become safe if you sacrificed enough. But eventually, your soul becomes too awakened to continue surviving that way. And that awakening changes your energy completely. You stop chasing, not because you no longer care about love, but because you finally understand your worth cannot depend on someone else's emotional availability. This is one of the most important turning points in the twin flame journey. Because many divine unions only begin aligning after both souls stop operating from wounded attachment patterns. And one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity is this. You stop trying to force connections that require self-abandonment. That does not mean you become emotionally cold. It means you become emotionally conscious. You begin recognizing when a connection drains your spirit instead of nourishing it. You stop making excuses for inconsistency. You stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. You stop interpreting bare minimum effort as deep love. And most importantly, you stop begging people to choose you. That shift is sacred, because spiritually aligned love does not require constant persuasion. It does not require emotional performance. It does not require proving your value endlessly. Real alignment recognizes value naturally. And once your soul truly understands that, counterfeit connections lose power over you. That is why some of you suddenly feel detached from people you once obsessed over. The emotional spell is breaking. Not because the memories disappeared, but because awareness entered the situation. You finally see the relationship clearly instead of through fantasy. You recognize how much anxiety you carried constantly. How often you felt emotionally unsafe. How much energy you spent trying to maintain connection with someone who rarely met you halfway. And although accepting this truth hurts, it also frees you. Because now your soul is no longer confusing emotional suffering with spiritual destiny. This is the stage where many chosen souls begin reclaiming themselves fully. They rediscover boundaries, self-respect, discernment, inner peace. For the first time, they begin asking themselves questions like, what actually feels healthy to my spirit? What kind of love allows me to remain authentic? What would happen if I stopped chasing unavailable people entirely? And those questions create energetic transformation. Because your energy shifts dramatically when you stop operating from desperation. Suddenly, you become more selective, more intuitive, more protective of your emotional space. You stop entertaining connections that immediately feel emotionally draining. You trust your intuition faster. You no longer ignore red flags simply because attraction exists. And although this stage may temporarily feel lonely, it is actually evidence of spiritual evolution. You are no longer willing to trade your peace for temporary validation. That is growth. And strangely enough, this emotional detachment from counterfeit love often happens right before major spiritual alignment enters someone's life. Why? Because the soul is finally becoming available for healthier connection. Not just emotionally available, energetically available. There is a difference. Many people claim they want divine love while still emotionally attached to toxic cycles internally. They still crave the emotional highs of inconsistency. They still confuse anxiety with chemistry. They still chase people who reinforce old wounds. But once the soul genuinely releases those patterns, the energetic frequency changes. You stop vibrating at the level of emotional chaos. And because of that, different experiences begin entering your reality. This is why spiritual surrender matters so much before twin flame alignment. Surrender does not mean giving up on love. It means releasing control over how love must appear. It means trusting that what is truly aligned will not require endless self-betrayal to maintain. And yes, surrender feels terrifying initially, especially if you spent years emotionally attached to outcomes. Some of you feared that letting go meant losing your chance forever. But spiritually, releasing attachment often creates the space necessary for alignment to unfold naturally. Because attachment and alignment are not the same thing. Attachment says, I need this person to choose me so I can feel whole. Alignment says, what is meant for me will recognize me without requiring self-destruction. That shift changes the soul profoundly. And perhaps this is why your spirit feels different now. Quieter, more observant, less reactive. You are beginning to realize that not every connection deserves access to your energy. Not everyone who desires your attention deserves your vulnerability. Not everyone who enters your life is spiritually aligned with your destiny. Discernment becomes your protection now. And that discernment was earned through every painful lesson you survived. Every false lover taught your soul something valuable. One taught boundaries. One taught self-worth. One taught emotional accountability. One taught you how to stop abandoning your intuition. One taught you that chemistry without consistency eventually becomes emotional suffering. Those lessons refined your spirit. And now, because of everything you endured, you are finally approaching love differently. Not from desperation. Not from fear. But from awareness. You no longer want someone who only awakens your emotions temporarily. You want someone who honors your soul consistently. Someone whose presence creates peace instead of confusion. Someone whose actions match their words. Someone emotionally mature enough to sustain vulnerability instead of running from it. And that desire reflects spiritual growth. Because the awakened soul no longer chases intensity alone. It seeks alignment, truth, safety, mutual evolution. That is why the moment you stop chasing false love becomes so spiritually powerful. It marks the death of emotional survival patterns, and the birth of discernment strong enough to recognize divine connection when it finally appears. So if you have recently felt detached from old attachments, if certain people no longer affect you the way they once did, if your soul suddenly craves peace more than emotional stimulation, do not fear the change happening inside you. This is not emotional numbness. This is awakening. Your spirit is no longer preparing for counterfeit connection. It is preparing for something real. And perhaps that is why every false lover had to appear first. Not to ruin your destiny, but to teach your soul the difference between being emotionally consumed and being spiritually aligned. At some point on the spiritual journey, a painful realization begins transforming into wisdom. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" And you begin asking, "What was this experience trying to teach my soul?" That shift changes everything. Because for most of your life, heartbreak probably felt personal. Every rejection felt like proof that you were not enough. Every betrayal felt like evidence that love was unsafe. Every ending felt like another confirmation that something inside you was fundamentally difficult to love. But spiritual awakening slowly reveals a deeper truth. Not everyone who entered your life came to stay. Some came to reveal. Some came to awaken. Some came to redirect your destiny by forcing your soul out of emotional illusions you would have otherwise remain trapped inside forever. And perhaps that is one of the hardest truths to accept. Because when we are emotionally attached to someone, we naturally focus on what we hoped the relationship would become. We mourn the future we imagined, the life we pictured, the version of the person we desperately wanted to believe in. But spirit often sees relationships differently than the human heart does. Where you saw permanence, spirit saw a lesson. Where you saw destiny, spirit saw preparation. Where you saw rejection, spirit saw redirection. That does not mean your pain was imaginary. It was real. The sleepless nights were real. The anxiety was real. The tears were real. The confusion was real. Some of you genuinely loved people who were emotionally incapable of protecting your heart. Some of you stayed loyal long after the relationship stopped nourishing your spirit. Some of you carried entire relationships emotionally while secretly hoping the other person would eventually meet you halfway. And when those relationships collapsed, it felt like your soul collapsed with them. But now, standing farther away from those experiences, you're beginning to recognize something important. Every false lover exposed a wound that needed healing before divine alignment could safely enter your life. That is why the relationships felt spiritually intense. Not because they were always your final destination, but because they activated the exact emotional patterns your soul needed to confront consciously. One relationship exposed abandonment wounds. Another exposed people-pleasing tendencies. Another revealed fear of loneliness. Another forced you to confront how often you accepted emotional inconsistency just to avoid losing connection. Another showed you that being desired is not the same as being genuinely valued. Every connection carried a lesson hidden beneath the attraction. And spiritually, that matters deeply. Because twin flame unions do not simply magnify love. They magnify truth. Everything hidden surfaces. Every insecurity. every fear, every unresolved emotional pattern. That is why your soul had to encounter counterfeit love first. Without those painful experiences, you may never have recognized the difference between attachment and alignment. You may have mistaken emotional obsession for sacred connection forever. You may have continued abandoning yourself to keep emotionally unavailable people close. But heartbreak awakened discernment. And discernment is one of the greatest forms of spiritual protection. Now, when you look back honestly, you can probably see patterns you once ignored. You can see how often your intuition warned you early. The inconsistency, the emotional distance, the mixed signals, the feeling that you were constantly overgiving. Deep down, part of your spirit always sensed something was misaligned. But your wounds kept convincing you to stay. Because wounded people often confuse emotional familiarity with spiritual safety. If you spent years feeling emotionally unseen, even temporary attention can feel intoxicating. If you grew up fearing abandonment, you may cling to relationships long after they become emotionally unhealthy. If your self-worth depended heavily on external validation, you may tolerate confusion simply because losing the connection feels unbearable. And counterfeit lovers unconsciously activate those wounds, not necessarily because they are evil, but because wounded souls attract wounded dynamics until healing begins. That is why many chosen souls repeatedly encountered emotionally unavailable people before awakening. Fully, Spirit was exposing the patterns, not to shame you, but to free you, because awareness always comes before transformation. And once awareness arrives, your energy starts changing. You stop romanticizing emotional suffering. You stop glorifying inconsistency as passion. You stop chasing people who repeatedly disconnect you from yourself. Instead, your soul begins craving truth, clarity, consistency, peace. At first, this shift can feel strange, almost uncomfortable, because chaos once felt emotionally familiar. Many spiritually sensitive people spent so long surviving emotional instability that healthy energy initially feels unfamiliar to the nervous system. But eventually, healing rewires your understanding of love completely. You realize that genuine connection does not require constant confusion. You realize that emotional safety is not weakness. You realize that healthy love should expand your spirit instead of draining it constantly. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all is this: you were never rejected because you lacked value. You were redirected because those connections lacked alignment. That truth heals something deep inside the soul. Because many of you spent years internalizing the behavior of emotionally immature people as proof that you were somehow unworthy. You blamed yourself for relationships that were spiritually designed to end. You questioned your worth because temporary people could not sustain permanent depth. But depth has always frightened emotionally unavailable people. Because real intimacy requires self-awareness, accountability, vulnerability, emotional honesty, and many people desire connection without being willing to evolve enough to maintain it. That is why some people loved your energy but could not stay aligned with your spirit long term. Your presence challenged them. Your depth exposed them. Your emotional truth forced hidden wounds to the surface. And instead of healing, some chose avoidance, distance, escape. But none of that diminished your value. It simply revealed their limitations. This is why spiritually awakened people eventually stop taking every ending personally. Not because they stop caring, but because they begin understanding energetic alignment more deeply. Some people enter your life only for a season. Some only to awaken a lesson. Some only to redirect your path away from emotional cycles that would have delayed your destiny. And once you truly accept this, forgiveness becomes easier. Not immediate, but easier. Because forgiveness no longer means pretending the pain did not happen. It means recognizing that every painful experience contributed to your awakening somehow. Even the betrayals, even the abandonment, even the heartbreak that once nearly destroyed you emotionally. Some of your deepest wisdom was born from those seasons. You became more intuitive, more discerning, more emotionally aware, more protective of your peace. You learned how to recognize emotional manipulation faster. You learned how to stop chasing people who thrive on confusion. You learned how to trust your intuition instead of constantly doubting yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you learned how to stop abandoning yourself for love. That lesson changes destinies, because self-abandonment can never lead to sacred union. A twin flame connection requires authenticity, truth, mutual growth. It cannot thrive where one soul constantly sacrifices their emotional well-being just to maintain connection. That is why Spirit allowed counterfeit relationships to collapse first. Not to punish you, but to prevent you from building your future upon unstable foundations. And now, because of everything you survived, your standards are changing spiritually. You no longer want temporary emotional highs. You want peace. You want emotional safety. You want honesty that remains consistent even when life becomes difficult. You want connection that nourishes your spirit instead of draining it constantly. That desire reflects awakening, because the soul that once chased emotionally unavailable people is evolving into someone capable of recognizing divine alignment clearly. And perhaps that is the hidden purpose behind every false lover who appeared before your twin flame. They taught discernment. They exposed wounds. They shattered illusions. They forced healing. They awakened self-worth. They redirected your path. Without them, you may never have evolved into the version of yourself capable of sustaining sacred love safely. That does not mean the suffering was easy, but it means the suffering was not meaningless. Every painful ending carried hidden preparation inside it. Every betrayal refined your spirit. Every disappointment strengthened your discernment. Every season of loneliness deepened your relationship with yourself. And now, standing on the other side of those lessons, you are beginning to understand something profound. The people who broke your heart were never powerful enough to destroy your destiny. If anything, they unknowingly guided you toward it, because every false lover eventually taught your soul one final truth. Love that requires self-betrayal can never be the love meant for your highest spiritual path. And once your soul truly understands that, alignment finally becomes possible. If you have made it this far in the journey, then your soul has already survived more than most people will ever understand. You survived the false promises, the emotional confusion, the sleepless nights, the betrayal that made you question your worth, the loneliness that felt endless, the relationships that awakened your deepest wounds instead of your deepest peace. You survived seasons where you gave love endlessly while secretly wondering if anyone would ever love you with the same depth in return. And perhaps the hardest part of all, you survived becoming a completely different person because of everything you experienced. That transformation was not small. The version of you who began this journey is not the same version listening now. Back then, you chased people who could not choose you fully. You ignored intuition because you feared losing connection. You tolerated emotional inconsistency because loneliness felt heavier than confusion. You mistook emotional intensity for spiritual destiny. But now, your soul sees differently. Not perfectly, but consciously. And consciousness changes everything. Because once awakening begins, you can no longer return comfortably to relationships that require self-betrayal. Your spirit becomes too aware, too sensitive to energetic truth, too emotionally mature to survive counterfeit love the way you once did. That is why many of you feel emotionally detached from old patterns now. You no longer crave emotional chaos. You no longer feel impressed by empty words. You no longer want connections built upon anxiety, uncertainty, or emotional starvation. Instead, your soul has started craving something deeper. Peace, truth, consistency, safety, mutual growth. And that shift is not random. It is evidence that your spirit has evolved through every painful lesson you endured. You see, the twin flame journey was never only about finding another person. It was always about becoming aligned with your authentic self first. Because sacred love cannot fully enter a life dominated by fear, emotional dependency, or self-abandonment. That is why the false lovers had to appear before divine union. Not because spirit wanted to punish you, but because your soul needed preparation. Without those lessons, you might still be chasing emotionally unavailable people. You might still confuse obsession with destiny. You might still abandon your intuition in exchange for temporary validation. But heartbreak refined your discernment. Pain awakened your boundaries. Disappointment forced spiritual maturity. And now your soul recognizes things it once ignored. You can feel emotional inconsistency immediately. You notice when someone's actions do not match their words. You sense energetic misalignment faster. You recognize when a connection drains your spirit instead of nourishing it. That awareness is sacred, because discernment protects destiny. And perhaps this is why your journey had to unfold exactly as it did. If your prayers had been answered earlier, you may have settled for relationships that could never sustain your soul long term. If certain people had stayed, they might have delayed your awakening even longer. If some endings had not shattered you emotionally, you may never have discovered your true worth spiritually. That is why so many chosen souls eventually look back at painful endings with completely different eyes. At first, they saw rejection. Later, they recognized protection. At first, they saw abandonment. Later, they recognized redirection. At first, they saw destruction. Later, they recognized transformation. And maybe that is exactly what is happening for you now. Perhaps for the first time, you are beginning to understand that your story was never cursed. It was guided. Even during the painful parts. Even during the lonely seasons. Even during the moments where you cried wondering why love kept disappearing from your life. Spirit was never trying to destroy your heart. Spirit was teaching your soul how to recognize real alignment. Because real alignment feels different. It does not require constant emotional survival. It does not leave you perpetually anxious. It does not force you to beg for consistency. It does not require endless self-sacrifice to maintain connection. True alignment may challenge you spiritually, but it also creates emotional clarity. And once your soul experiences that difference, you can never fully return to counterfeit love again. That is why many of you feel spiritually between worlds right now. You no longer resonate with old relationship patterns. But your next chapter has not fully revealed itself yet. This stage can feel uncomfortable, almost empty at times. But spiritually, it is sacred transition. The soul often enters temporary solitude before major alignment unfolds. Why? Because silence strengthens discernment. Solitude deepens intuition. Distance from emotional chaos restores clarity. And clarity is necessary before sacred union. Many chosen souls mistakenly fear this stage because it feels unfamiliar. The ego interprets stillness as loneliness. But spiritually, stillness is often preparation. Something inside you is stabilizing emotionally. You are learning how to remain connected to yourself even without external validation. You are learning how to protect your peace. You are learning how to trust your intuition. You are learning that love should feel emotionally safe, not emotionally exhausting. Those lessons matter deeply, because twin flame unions require emotional responsibility from both souls. Not perfection. Responsibility. The willingness to heal. To communicate honestly. To confront wounds consciously instead of projecting them onto each other endlessly. And perhaps this is why your spirit had to grow stronger first. You are no longer the version of yourself who once accepted breadcrumbs while calling it love. You are no longer emotionally available for relationships built upon confusion. You are no longer willing to lose yourself just to keep someone else. That evolution changes your energetic frequency entirely. And when your frequency changes, the kinds of connections you attract begin changing too. That is why many spiritually awakened people encounter divine alignment only after surrender. Not surrendering love itself, but surrendering unhealthy attachment to how love must appear. Because attachment says, I need this specific person, or I will never feel whole. Alignment says, what is truly meant for my soul will not require me to abandon myself to receive it. That realization frees the spirit profoundly. It allows peace to enter where anxiety once lived. It allows trust to replace desperation. It allows emotional stability to replace obsession. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you're beginning to understand that love was never supposed to feel like survival. It was supposed to feel like truth. That does not mean every future moment will be easy. Sacred unions still require growth, honesty, vulnerability, and emotional maturity. But divine love does not thrive on emotional confusion the way counterfeit love does. It expands your spirit instead of shrinking it. It inspires healing instead of constant insecurity. It creates deeper authenticity instead of forcing performance. And your soul is finally becoming ready for that kind of connection now. Not because you suddenly became worthy. You were always worthy. But because you have finally started recognizing your own worth clearly enough to stop settling for less. That is the real transformation. And perhaps that is the final spiritual lesson hidden beneath every false lover who entered your life before your twin flame. They were never the destination. They were the contrast that taught your soul what real alignment would eventually feel like. Without darkness, you may never have recognized light. Without confusion, you may never have valued clarity. Without emotional chaos, you may never have understood the sacredness of peace. Every painful lesson sharpened your discernment. Every ending strengthened your spirit. Every disappointment pushed you closer toward awakening. And now, standing on the edge of a new chapter, your soul finally understands something it once struggled to believe. What is truly meant for you will never require you to destroy yourself in order to keep it. So if this message found you at the exact moment your spirit needed confirmation, take a deep breath and hear this clearly. Your destiny was never destroyed by the people who hurt you. Your destiny survived every betrayal, every abandonment, every false promise, every counterfeit connection. And now, after everything your soul has endured, you are no longer being prepared for another lesson disguised as love. You are being prepared for alignment. If this message resonated deeply with your spirit, comment, I release false love and accept divine alignment. And remember, the people who could not recognize your value were never powerful enough to cancel what spirit already wrote into your destiny.